You got multiple Active Directories and sources of truth of users. You got a trust model that assumes full trust once you're inside of a network perimeter. You've got lots of business applications doing authorization all sorts of different ways. You've got like messy, non-observable ACLs, some that live on the firewall, some that live in the directory, some that live in like a third-party software. And you got scripts kind of like stitching all this stuff together. And a security team with like visibility at the network traffic layer, hoping for the best.
Hey everyone, Claire here, producer of All Aboard. In today's episode, Alex sits down with identity legend Karl McGuinness. Karl is a product and technology leader with over 25 years of experience building mission-critical internet-scale identity platforms. He was formerly the chief product architect at Okta and played a pivotal role in building the world's first vendor-neutral identity cloud. Alex and Karl break down the early days of enterprise identity. We're talking thick clients, group sprawl, Active Directory chaos, and how it all set the stage for the cloud era. If you've ever wondered how we got here and where the history of identity security really started, this is the place to be. Let's dive in.
Karl, thanks for joining the podcast, man. And actually, this is gonna be better than a podcast because what we're gonna do is turn this into a history of identity series with none other than yourself, kind of leading the conversation.
Dude. Excited to be here.
I thought about doing. Have you ever seen on the History Channel where they do like the drunk history thing where they kind of explain like
that would be a lot funner.
It did occur to me to let's have like 4 or 5 beers and then do the history of identity and see how.
It might be a follow-up episode.
Okay, all right, sure, fair enough. So cool. So for everyone listening to this on the ConductorOne Academy, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself? Because you're not a newbie in the identity space. What's your background, man?
Sure, thanks. So I started in identity way back when in the 90s, did sort of NT to 2000 Active Directory migrations and sort of Novell stuff way back when. In the 2000s era was sort of the rise of the IDP. I was working in healthcare and did a bunch of IDP work and web services work there with identity. And then in the cloud first mobile era, I joined Okta early on and drove a lot of the key design and product thinking as far as how Okta grew from early stage to a multi-billion-dollar company, and ended up being the chief product architect there and driving a lot of what Okta is today. So I've been doing identity for over 2 decades and saw all the different transitions from client server to mobile to the cloud to now the exciting agentic native AI stuff.
Yeah, man. It's like 3 or 4 revolutions in there, 3 or 4 waves.
Yeah, totally.
Minimum. Yeah. Awesome. And for anybody listening, I had the fortune of working with you at Okta, where typically the interaction was like, I would come up with some harebrained thing. You'd look at it and be like, actually, it should be like this.
Bovee
Designs. Oh, you're right.
Bovee Designs.
Bovee Designs. Hey, it all ended up working out. It worked out okay.
Hey man, when you're a startup, you got to focus on that customer value and be very cutthroat on what avenues you chase, because you can spend a lot of calories chasing a lot of things that aren't driving bottom line. And so there's a lot of interesting partnerships back then to try to move the ball forward, ship stuff, add value. It's full time.
Not break things. Yeah, totally. Cool. Well, then let's start. I was thinking not starting at the very, very beginning, but let's start at the on-prem era, because I think that's probably the
still around today.
It's still around today, actually. Exactly. And I think it's probably really interesting. I think people don't even understand what that technology environment looked like. So maybe just start with, what was that world? What was the look, smell, shape, feel of the technology environment look like, and what did identity look like there?
Yeah, awesome. So a lot of the identity technology kind of paralleled sort of the macro sort of architecture and sort of business trends that were happening during the era. So client server era, right? Productivity gains was everyone getting a PC, using productivity software, Windows, rise of Win32. That era, right, of thick thick applications, how do you deploy and manage it, cost of managing desktop. Identity was really sort of more bundled into the identity layer of Windows and how all that worked. And, having a sort of independent identity business really wasn't, long-term successful, as seen by, Novell didn't make it. and the rise of directories, right? Centralized directories and centralizing, authentication. As more and more desktops got deployed, like how do we centralize a lot of those aspects, right? So you have management of the desktop, management of identities, management of passwords, integrating that into sort of the thick applications. Then the web hit, and when the web hit, applications started to shift, architecture started to shift, distribution started to shift. As that started to shift, the technologies to manage those, needed to change. And that started, the more modern sort of identity software that we think of today kind of paralleled both the rise of the web and sort of how businesses adopted the web, as well as regulatory, right? So the part that isn't often a lot of talked about is like late 2000 or early 2000s. You saw HIPAA, you saw PCI, you saw Sarbanes-Oxley, all, modern sort of regulation at the time that really changed the requirements into IT as far as what, security and access control and accountability and needed to do. And so obviously that wrote, whole new set of vendors coming in to sort of sell a new technology stack. And then this is the era of web services, right? Of thick Java, XML engines, right? B2B engines and things like that. So this is where you started seeing, not just Microsoft and having an identity layer that's sort of bound to Windows, but really the need to really start, automating the business process side of access, driven by compliance. And this is why, the natural vendors that kind of fell through there was, you have Sun, IBM, Oracle, because these are the folks that, have the enterprise businesses. They have the B2B, Java software stacks. Everyone has an XML business process engine. Hey, let me just throw that at a, lifecycle problem, build some connectors for the, financial apps for the key specific types of applications. So you kind of had this like dual world where like SMB mid-market, right, was happy just sort of, consuming Microsoft stack. A few different sort of applications deployed that might be web-based. And then the enterprise really sort of having to sort of up-level its stack around, kind of four main components, probably a directory, probably a lifecycle management business process engine type software, probably a federation engine, and probably a access manager. And because a lot of the apps weren't SSO, right, you had a lot of sort of agent-based WAM, web access management type technologies where all the access was on-prem. So you funneled all the HTTP traffic through your data center. You had all the middleware products sitting there. You could put policies on URLs and, do a lot of stuff with session cookies because it's all single origin. And, the modern web that we think of today with all the distributed endpoints and things like that was much more finite. So the stack really grew with I think the era, which is like centralized server technologies to then more and more collaboration, more and more B2B, putting pressure on organizations to think about cross-organization problem statements would open up federation technologies, regulatory requirements driving need for lifecycle management technologies, taking applications that, were just written for the, web 1.0 and trying to put access management technologies on top of them so you can get some policy applications. And that was kind of, I think, the key stack kind of coming out of the late 2000s was kind of looking at, you have Sun, Oracle, IBM, sort of all with their enterprise stacks. You had Microsoft sitting there with sort of the Exchange and Active Directory combo because they owned the mail software. And then obviously mobile was kind of this early wave that kind of had a miss. You had BlackBerry, you had Windows Mobile. Policy really was around email. Trying to integrate those things into the enterprise because you had VPNs and trying to, you didn't have all your stuff on the public internet. And VPNs was, a common theme in the eras that we'll probably come back to. So I think, the stacks to me kind of ebb and flowed with the technology shifts and with the needs and compliance shifts and organizations responding to that, and having different degrees of success based on how native or how well they solve certain parts of the problem. And as we, I think, see in the later phases, that a lot of those technology choices didn't make the transition once you started decentralizing decisions, once you started having applications move outside the firewall, once you started having more and more connections across organizations and things like that, sort of broke the...
Yeah, I mean, let's dig into this and talk a little bit more about that world from like a security perspective, because I think that actually is so much of that architecture, that like castle and moat, the centralized Active Directory and, the applications all on-prem and you're protecting URLs and network traffic and all this kind of good stuff really impacted, I think, some of the things that broke on the security side when we did the cloud transition later as well. So just to like to get into that conversation a little bit, like what were some of the security implications of the on-prem world? Like where were the weaknesses at?
Yeah.
Where were how did those companies get attacked back then? What did the threats look like?
I mean, if everyone remembers back to just like a great example is like Windows XP Service Pack 2, right? Like Windows XP was, the dominant operating system this is like 2001, 2002, maybe. And malware just started hitting the scene, right? Left and right. And Windows was just getting clobbered. These networks are getting clobbered with malware, right? So you'd get somebody downloading some email attachment, running it. And because the Windows single sign-on infrastructure instantly allowed lateral movement, right? Viruses and malware could just go all over your internal networks, right? And take down, and it was becoming a significant problem. Significant enough that Microsoft had to reshift their roadmaps, refocus back on some of the basic security primitives inside of Windows, because the platform itself really wasn't designed for downloading software and running it and having different trust boundaries and trust models. It was a full trust network, right?
Yeah.
And so now you're starting to understand, hey, this threat model, hey, I need to protect my infrastructure and my data from, attacks, not just from, users downloading content from the internet, and running it on my networks. You also had remote access, right? So you started to opening up, not everybody that was working in your organization was working on the same WAN, and you're trying to bridge these network sites together. You have, a lot of different types of technologies coming around to enable global organizations to collaborate, opening up more and more network paths across your organization. And so again, if you assumed, only the desktop sitting in the particular building could talk to the particular app sitting on a particular app server, right? And, allow less than IP address, like that started getting much more complex. You do these overlapping IP spaces. You're trying to bridge all this stuff together. You have network teams with very complex network topologies, increasingly trying to bridge that stuff together and try to monitor it. So I think like one wave was just the endpoint, just the change of the internet being on the endpoint. Another wave was the rise of remote access and B2B and having other entities that you didn't really necessarily had before. And then, just the scalable attack vector aspect of software, folks trying, figuring out and distributing more scalable attacks just as they learned just how powerful and pattern. Once you see it done once, you're like, oh, that's a new avenue, right? Let me double click on it. And that's where the security industry started happening, right? You have like secure web gateway, SWIGs, and things like that, right? Those technologies in the early 2000s weren't really heavily deployed because the idea of having to filter people's browsers traffic, accessing apps on the internet, right? And then as malware and all these things happen, you started the need to sort of like put a man in the middle and start understanding egress traffic and all these types of problem statements. Same with your VPNs and IDS and intrusion detection. So a lot of these like security vendors we see today, they got their start selling, those early sort of internet protection software and hardware packages that help the enterprise with the threats at the time. But then obviously mobile and cloud in the next era completely flipped a lot of that on its head and needed an architecture change.
Yeah, and it's I like to talk about that old world as like it was like the M&M security model. It was like the hard on the outside shell, like the VPN protected all the traffic. But then once you're on the inside, to your point, lateral movement, you're authenticated because you're on the device. Like it's kind of like game over at that point.
The apps didn't change that much, right? Like that's like, you got to think about the world pre-virtualization software, even, right? VMware. Like we were now like containers and all this other stuff, but like back then, like you didn't even have VMs. Like you had physical servers procured with enterprise license agreements that were perpetual, deploying software. Like, so the world just didn't move as fast with software adoption, end user choice around software and things like that. And so that kind of, catered towards a little bit of, I think, the IT control aspect, because they were responsible for, deploying and managing and securing some of the software. The life cycles of that stuff was much, much different than what we see today. The bottoms up adoption wasn't really possible. And getting access to the data and things like that. And just people you got to mind, people are just deploying databases for the first time. SQL was just rising, right? And the power of a SQL database inside these organizations. And then all the things that start connecting to all that and things like that. All the PAM stuff we see today started because back then it was just like a few trusted connections into your SQL database, because the performance of that stuff couldn't scale to support all those different types of workloads.
Yep. And actually, you touched on something that I think is like going to be an important thread, like as a pull through, which is who owns identity and who owns identity security. And like because in that old on-prem world, you got IT that, maybe running the help desk, doing change management across your assets or deploying assets, procuring assets. You had a security team, maybe early days of one.
Yep.
And you got a network team, but like how did companies collaborate?
The organizations that I saw, security tended to be more closer to network teams than it did towards IT. IT owned Active Directory and it owned endpoint, right? And then through that, it brokered its relationships into VPN because VPN tended to be a network device at the time. It wasn't all software based. And so it tended to be owned by the network organization. So the network teams owned your Cisco PIX firewalls, your VPNs, those types of devices were owned by the network teams. And so they tended to have a higher say in security because the network segmentation strategies was the security model. And then on the IT side, the fact that, again, the bundling of Windows and how it worked with Office and Exchange and the dominance of Exchange drove Active Directory, and how Active Directory was a successful sort of tentacle out, sort of drove the identity from a desktop perspective. And so you can think about user pieces that all kind of rotate around Active Directory, security pieces all rotate around network. And then if you're in the highly regulatory compliance driven things, that lifecycle management became a net new problem that ended up falling on IT because it ended up being a systems integration problem, right?
Right. Yep. Makes sense. And then on the security side, it also makes sense that it would align to network because that was how that was how you got visibility to what was going on from a threat perspective. It was like, is there funny traffic? Like I remember, all the companies that would put technology on top of your firewall or live at the edge of your network to try to detect intrusion, like all that.
Totally. And then mobile just tried to early days of mobile, like you had to backhaul all of your traffic through your enterprise VPN to the Midwest to some data center that had this like crappy pipe to like the actual server, right? Because that's the network topologies that were in place because of the, whatever network peering agreement that, your enterprise data center had to, connect to the internet and how things work, right? So that kind of put the handicap on a lot of that stuff early on because those were the controls in place. And so that's why the early, adopters of that kind of fit within those kind of still a network based model because it pretty much assumed it to be a VPN architecture to get to data.
Right.
Because nobody really was exposing a lot of stuff to the public web. I think like Outlook Web Access started to early on start getting demands to kind of like, I need to access my email from a home PC and I don't want to, VPN in. And so that started to rise like, well, wait a minute, now I'm exposing my Active Directory credentials to public web threats. And so then that kind of, started a whole new curve of problems. It's sort of like, maybe we need MFA and RSA tokens and all our stuff started to come with that. Right.
And then click into a little bit of like the lifecycle management engine, because I think even then there were ways to do those things more manually versus like obviously at scale if you're rapidly scaling.
Yeah, like just think about Active Directory. One of the successes of Active Directory was like people could invest themselves into the technology and jump jobs and have repeatable jobs because of the Microsoft platform, right? Their backwards compatibility, their investment into the Microsoft ecosystem pretty much meant that you could learn some basic scripting or some basic automation on the Windows side, right? And then that was your job. Your job was sysadmin, right? And as a sysadmin, like you had your own little ways of handling the workflow, whether it was ClickOps, whether it was I have this little script I wrote, and you could take that skill set and jump between jobs because everybody had the same Active Directory mess in every job you went to. And so you had this high, talent pool of skill sets and a high, need in the sense of everybody had these really complex growing Active Directories, M&As, mergers, forests, issues, right? And all the Exchange stuff just kept being a constant maintenance nightmare to try to manage. So I just felt like at that time, at least on the Windows side, you saw a lot of it. It was kind of the two camps. There was like third-party software like Quest, which kind of filled gaps in AD roadmap, right? So AD is kind of set in this weird place because like it indirectly made money, right? Because you had a Windows license fund.
Right.
Active Directory. You didn't buy Active Directory. You bought Windows Server Cal. You bought a Windows license, a client access license, or you bought an Exchange license. And that a lot of Microsoft stuff, you have to kind of look through the lens of like, who was the platform team? Who was the product team? Where was the revenue recognized? And how do requirements get pushed down? And like, who was serving who? Because a lot of that technology was developed as a means to support, a product objective, right? So like Active Directory Federation Server came to fruition because of SharePoint. SharePoint drove the need for federation.
It was like an enabling technology to adopt this other Microsoft product that they were actually monetizing.
Yeah. And so then like, were they really focused on, the larger lifecycle management challenges? Like at that time, that was not a key priority. So it was left to the ecosystem to solve. And so like you don't have a lot of primitives in Active Directory to support what we think of as modern identity, because it was really just, here's an LDAP directory, here's some stuff to manage Windows, because Windows was the driving ass, group policy and stuff like that, right? And GPOs.
And so you got help desk tickets, you got PowerShell scripts, you got all these manual processes or a little bit of scripting.
And then third-party software came in and provided like, oh wait, wouldn't it be nice to have like roles and like be able to put roles on top of Active Directory and be able to request, like all that became this like ecosystem of third-party Microsoft partner solutions and stuff like that. And so you saw this wave of sort of, I don't know if we're going to call it middleware, but sort of point solutions for gaps in AD things. And then you at the enterprise level, which is like, hey, we actually, are going to build this hire a consultant, build a workflow engine, or shake XML and customize workflow, right? And you have all the complexities of a complex, stateful workflow, right? How that stuff is probably triggers and execution and retries.
And how did like, say a company did M&A, like what's breaking in that? Like, was the goal always to have like a canonical user model, or did companies just say, you know what, we're just going to stitch these things together and try to make it work, and it's more scripting?
So this is one of the challenges with Active Directory, was it being tied to the operating system security model. It made, I think it made identity portability across these use cases much more challenging. Because you had to figure out, like, you had all these like Windows file shares, right? With all these like ACLs and permission statements that were tied to like identifiers that were tied to like directories, right? And the federation model and trying to put that on top of this Active Directory model and bridge it in was just insanely, I think, complex. And so you had all these proliferation forests, right? Active Directory forests, because for many reasons, we could have a whole conversation about Active Directory forests, but for the interest of time, it just became the only mechanism you had to isolate or to clean room a new solution, or to start putting a boundary. There's a lot of security issues in just how the domain versus forest boundary stuff works in Active Directories. There's like, it's not a perfect boundary, just due to just how some of the underlying technology works. So you had people deploying more and more forests, whether that was for administrative autonomy, branch offices, centralized IT with distributed organizations, a lot of different sort of MSPs, all these different types of things drove very complex Active Directory architectures. And it wasn't so easy to sort of just merge Active Directories. And so you had lifecycle management software, sync software, start getting in place, which started your complex business rules for syncing data across directories, right?
Yeah.
And so those things became, very, very complex to debug, very, very complex to maintain, because you're getting into sort of implicit and explicit, business rules, and, just trying to.
And so you can, like, zooming out, you can start to see why this world's kind of crazy and actually pretty bad. You got multiple Active Directories and sources of truth of users. You got a trust model that assumes full trust once you're inside of a network perimeter. You've got lots of business applications doing authorization all sorts of different ways. You've got like messy, non-observable ACLs, some that live on the firewall, some that live in the directory, some that live in like a third-party software. And you got scripts kind of like stitching all this stuff together. And a security team with like visibility at the network traffic layer, hoping for the best.
One thing I would say, though, that's actually kind of interesting, though, is that you did see a desire from both vendors and the platforms to adopt centralized protocols versus, software. Meaning, like, we had syslog, we had LDAP, we had Kerberos, we had DNS, we had some of the Cisco stuff, TCAX, and some of the Radius, and like a bunch of stuff on the VPN side. I'm trying to remember from those days. So you had a desire for protocol being the interface to then plug in centralized policy or some of these use cases into things, which did enable some level of like vendors to play in and do these things. Whereas today, for example, like, there's no, outside of SSO, there's not a lot of, like, for example, protocols that SaaS speaks that lets you plug in your own centralized control plane or your own XYZ.
Across identity and
it's all choose your own adventure, built custom for the thing. So like, while you had a lot of the problems of being a moat-based architecture, and a lot of the wrong assumptions on trust and security boundaries, I did feel there was a sort of adoption of more protocol-centric approaches with PKI, with some of these things at the time. And that maybe just had a lot to do with the fact that you were buying these components, right, from different vendors and stitching them together on TCP/IP networks. And so you had you needed some level of interoperability at that level to operate, because it wasn't just API JSON connectors.
API, I was going to say you could almost make the argument that the API kind of ruined that path of like the protocol adoption, because everyone's like, oh, I have an
different
API,
dynamics, different dynamics, which shifted some of that, and I feel like we're
right. It pushed it to the customer actually to be like, oh, no, we have an API, like just integrate with this and like go do a development effort.
Well, also things move slowly, right? I mean, so as things move slowly, you can bake into a product cycle on-prem ship software that gets, updated every 2 to 3 years, like, some protocol that don't change the protocol, right? Because that's the thing we're using to talk, right, to everything.
Yep. And talk for us a second about like, because I think another interesting theme as we carry forward, I promise I'm going to get to the cloud era in a second, but like another interesting carry forward theme is complexity that entered those environments, particularly around things like AD group sprawl. Like what caused the group sprawl? Why was that the original sin? Like, how did that happen?
My take is, so AD is not a virtual directory, right? So an AD is you can't materialize groups based on queries, right, at runtime. So you can't just take business attributes, and use those to create groupings. So groupings are more static memberships, meaning that like you have to actually go in and create a link between a user and a group, right? You can nest groups, which has a layer of complexity, but it's a very structured entity inside your directory. And then the directories are hierarchical, and the groups in Active Directory serve multiple problems in the sense that because it's super integrated into the OS authentication layer, it's what surfaces inside a Windows security token. It gives you access to your actual desktop, and gives you access to Windows file shares. So it's like completely coupled to the Windows security model. And then you had this exchange problem where, hey, I need these other types of groups that are more email centric or distribution groups. And then applications had to sit there, and they didn't really have their own way to model authorization. And so I felt like one of the key problem statements was IT was in charge of a problem statement of trying to create structure around whether it's HR or however they arrange their directory structures, take business requirements and try to map application requirements into that, and then have that work with this OS security model from a versioning lifecycle perspective, where everything became too coupled to an outcome where they became too brittle from a change management perspective because it leaked across too many surface areas. It's like an encapsulation problem, right? Like groups were not encapsulated to a use case or to a context where you could understand the how it was being used. So unwinding all that context to this like global object that then is like, I don't know, is it used for email? I don't know, is it used over here? Is it it's nested 17 levels deep? And then you throw on top of it like, cross forest trust and all these other things where you're trying to like, deal with universal groups and forest architectures and things where you're like, wait a minute, I want one group that spans multiple domains. So they're going to like nest it over here to copy it over here to like get access to this. So fundamentally, I think it was just the partitioning strategy of Active Directory, the lack of being able to sort of create business context that has its own management structure around it that's closer to the applications, and sort of using the sort of IT modeling because they owned the email and the collaboration to drive all the downstream application use cases became just way too brittle, was my mind. And then your tools and visibility and all those other things weren't there, right? There's again, these are a bunch of products missing for like how to go about doing all that stuff, which is like, how do I even know where
it's being used and who's using it, and is it coupled to 5 different systems, and all that kind of good stuff.
I mean, a big learning always is just like closer to the resource authorization. You have context, right? The more you bring it up top, right? You could think of Active Directory as like the original IDP, right? So the more you try to bring all those application requirements into the IDP without context and start trying to model it all very generically and with something just called a group that's sort of just malleable in any way you want.
You can use it in any way you want to.
So naming conventions like dot underscore something means something in my architecture, right? And all the ontologies that you build on top of these structures, right? To try to get leverage, right? Because you want some level of scale leverage off these things. Just becomes very hard to manage as you have employees come and go, as applications come and go, and things come and go.
I mean, what's interesting, so then, and we're going to switch to cloud era in a second here, but pretty clearly like Active Directory was an infrastructure piece that was an enabling technology for the Microsoft ecosystem. And then you did have like your IGA vendors and other vendors kind of coming into the space saying, hey, you know what, we need actually a set of like building blocks that kind of more closely represent some of these first principle things that we need to do around identity and driving compliance and some of the automation around that to make customers more successful and be able to like rationalize it a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then, so that's what that world looked like.
Yep.
And then cloud started happening. Or did mobile happen first? I guess mobile kind of technically happened first, but like it felt like the same time to me.
I think a couple things started happening. So one was when we talked a little bit before about API, like, so that was a trend that kind of weaved in here, which was like one trend is just APIs. We started off with a service-oriented architecture, SOA web services. That actually drove a lot of need to like build a very complex. SAML really came out of that era, right, of web services and WS Trust and these types of interesting trust model architectures of brokering across trust domains and how to make that work with software from tokens and, PKI and message encryption and all these types of technologies. Then you had like the Web 2.0 kind of era happening as well, right? So this is like the rise of OAuth 1.0 and sort of like developers abandoning all that thick enterprise technology because the consumer web is picking up and adopting lightweight technologies to unlock valuable use cases like, Google Maps with, dynamic web pages, and it using Ajax. And, so you saw like OAuth and these lighter weight technologies dump a lot of that baggage. And so you had this like enterprise complexity, you had this consumer web happening, and that's like where JSON and a lot of JavaScript and a lot of those technologies come out of it. So at the end of the 2000s, like you had those two sort of waves kind of come and go and overlap, which kind of then in the 2010s kind of came out with and just happened, with SaaS and cloud. It kind of built itself off of, I think, the technology stack coming out of the consumer side, which rose, the rise of like OAuth and Facebook Connect, which drove OpenID Connect and a lot of these developer accessible technologies because applications and distributed applications and developer power are sort of changing into much more simpler technologies to sort of build these apps with. And then with that came the platform shift, right? From desktop to web to mobile, also changed the tech stack, right? And apps. So the app store and just how people procured and deployed apps, both from a phone and from a web perspective with SaaS, really broke a lot of those assumptions as far as how onboarding of applications work. How does identity, get into those apps? I have all these accounts now that are in my data center, so I can't just revoke access by revoking the VPN. I have multiple trust domains that I'm trying to figure out how to go across. And so it really was like a perfect way for single sign-on to really have its time.
Right.
Because single sign-on in the 2000s was really thought of more as Kerberos and Windows, control.
Yeah, it was like an internal business protocol, right? It was like, hey, I'm building a lightweight web application inside my firewall, and it was
web app. I mean, because you deployed a SiteMinder agent on your web server that integrate, into the web stack and did some cookie brokering into some central thing, but like it was really something that was done at that layer and not something done by the application developers. I mean, no app developers were writing SAML service providers, right? It was like, it was built into your platform. It was like hosted by Oracle or IBM stack, right? As a gateway component inside your app platform, right?
And so it was actually like it was like an STS for like a cookie for your downstream application.
Yeah, I mean, it was all that kind of stuff, right? Was going on in that. So it was like STS cookie or like Oracle or IBM or whatever would have a broker component in their app stack, and you have to buy their broker component to integrate it into your identity stack, right? So it was kind of bridging the identity layer. So as applications moved from the data center into the cloud and the endpoints moved from sitting inside your enterprise to, anywhere in the web or anywhere in the world because it's mobile, that kind of created some conditions that broke a lot of those assumptions. So one was, lifecycle. One was, again, the need for federation, authentication and things like that. One was the need for managing mobile devices. Because again, we were used to thinking them as PCs, right? I mean, even look at the failure of Windows Mobile. Like it tried to model the phone as a Windows with start menu. So like what's changed in those architecture, broke some of those assumptions about identity, device identity, how to bind identity, right, to known subjects when you have user driven enrollments and things like that. You had corporate driven phones, right? Laptops and phones were procured by IT. They were provisioned by IT, then hand it to you, right, as a company-owned device. And then as BYOD, and, because the consumer wave drove the usage of the architecture, which is the App Store, iPhone, XYZ, that was what I meant. It's like, you got to keep in mind, there was a consumer shift that happened sort of coming out of the second half that changed a lot of the assumptions into the procurement and the management of it, which broke, I think, some of those pieces. And so we saw this, like, Okta's primary use case, from early on was companies wanting to adopt these SaaS applications. The SaaS apps can't talk to your Active Directory behind the firewall.
It was like Salesforce. It was like Salesforce and Box and stuff, right?
Exactly.
It was like yeah.
So it was the glue to enable, the deployment of the modern cloud, which is kind of what you're maybe starting to see today in the next wave, which is agentic, which is similar types of problem statements, which is I'm trying to deploy these agents, but like I can't solve some of the authorization problem statements to do it. Who's going to be that layer to sort of enable the value of the developers and the app layer to kind of solve it without having to, have each app team rebuild integration layers for that stuff, right?
Yep. So then talk a little bit about, so we've got this adoption wave happening of almost like consumerization adoption of like enterprise technology in the cloud. People are trying out Box. They're saying, hey, this is really great. I want to like bring this into my business. IT team go support that. Is that what then is driving? That's what's stressing identity at that point, and to where it's like, well, I have no way of like provisioning users and getting users in this application.
It definitely drove the need for building the integration hub into the cloud, right? So when the integration point was on-prem, you have an N+1 problem where every possible net new thing you got to go do is like go back to your on-prem thing, get a hole in the firewall, negotiate some contract, do something, do the security thing. So there was a scalability thing, which was that you couldn't have tens to hundreds, like the growing rate of applications, rinse and repeat that heavyweight integration problem. And then with it carried a bunch of the assumptions of, well, if I'm actually connecting networks or creating back to DMZ connections and all these, you have all those security problem statements still, because you're coming in and bridging, your trust model of your M&M into something else in another, you talk about shared responsibility problem statements. Like you have a completely separate vendor organization, security team, XYZ, right? That's responsible for deploying and managing that application. And now you're trying to integrate that back into enterprise data. And so that became a trust problem statement for the CISO, for the CEO, for everybody, which is like, how do I adopt this technology in a way that minimizes risk when I don't control all the vendors and I can't deploy all the software my way. So I think that created, and then the consumption model of the device changing. So like it forced people to reevaluate their architectures. And so having a cloud identity layer that sort of just like anyone can sort of add applications to and easily connect to, I think simplified, get all my identity data into a central cloud, identity as a service type offering, manage all my applications from that point, distribute them to my apps, deploy MFA on top of that, connect my VPNs into that thing. And since it's in the cloud, I don't have to solve all those point-to-point networking, VPN routing issues, XYZ. And now I have a trust boundary because I can control what goes from AD to that layer. So I can feel like this is an externalized, part of my organization. It's not quite the system of record for my organization because Active Directory is still my system of record. I still have my internal systems in my system of record, but I've created sort of a external cloud layer that I can build integrations around for all of my external, application adoption and things like that was what we started to see earlier.
Yeah. There's like a fun, like, I know some companies still do it this way, but there's like a fun transitionary phase there too, where people would backhaul traffic to their on-prem networks, so they could federate users out into the cloud.
I mean, early on, at Okta, we had to build, delegated authentication, which was like folks didn't want their passwords into the cloud, but they didn't want to manage PKI and trust relationships for federation on-prem because that was really complex.
A lot of tech, yeah.
So they trusted sort of an external entity to manage the trust anchor, but they wanted the credentials on-prem because those credentials still had all of those on-prem attack areas. Like you could use the credentials through a VPN. You could use the credentials sitting in the office. So the credentials had significant value on the internal networks. So they didn't want those into the cloud because they didn't trust the cloud provider would be able to secure them. And so if they got attacked, I got the credential and I could still now attack all the internal on-prem.
Well, so that's like an important point too, because you talked about like how the cloud and the cloud IDP became this like new trust anchor outside of the firewall, but that actually broke a lot of the security assumptions that people had traditionally, and also you've got all this tech built up around your firewall and protection and lateral movement detection and network traffic analysis, and now you're like, I've got this person completely outside of that security world that's got my identities that can federate people in, they can get access to corporate data using that technology stack. how did that break security assumptions? And like, did organizations shift to allow that adoption? And like, to your point also on the responsibility model really shifted. Cause I remember people in that world being like, I don't trust these cloud providers with anything.
For sure.
Like, and it took a while to get there. We're like, yeah, tell me a little bit about like, how did that affect the team and the security model?
Yeah, so like Okta's problem early on was trust, right? It was like, how do we get organizations to trust us, right? It wasn't that it was hard to convince them on sort of the value of like time to value. It was on like, how do I get you to trust, a small startup to own your identity, right? And so the organizations, this is like, again, probably you saw the shift, the rise of sort of the CISO, the rise of, it's not just the SaaS application portfolios. You think about the change in the data centers. You think about cloud computing. We didn't talk about just sort of AWS and sort of coming out in the second half of, the 2000s and folks just starting to experiment with, compute and storage and other things that they were, not owning, right? Because they were so used to their storage area networks and designs around that, their data warehouses. So a lot of it is just a macro sort of like externalizing it onto service providers. How do you trust your service providers? How do you audit your service providers? You get your SOX type 2 and all, again, regulatory type stuff going on and all that. And so I think what happened over time was the value, so value tends to drive a lot, right? So business value, right? So the business value that a line of business or a stakeholder got by, so there's a shift here between like central IT and line of business, right? Line of business could make a case for adopting a tool or adopting SaaS or doing something because they could directly show how it impacted their numbers and say this tool helps me, get this business outcome.
Right. Central
IT had to go through the shift that kind of paralleled the shift from hosting Exchange to not wanting to host email, right? So that was the killer app for them was email. And the cost and maintenance of running Exchange servers for all these use cases, and then the shift to subscription and SaaS, right, became a much better economic model for them to adopt from managing the mail servers, that over time, the security or I must host it kind of didn't win to the economics of sort of managing Exchange.
So it became like financial and productivity oriented, both on the line of business owner and for IT.
I think the line of business kind of happened, earlier than central IT kind of came along with it as email shift to subscription. That's what my observation was. And so like, again, just going back to Okta's success, like riding the Office 365 adoption wave, right? Yeah. Drove the need for all these federation hybrid architectures, net new use cases. And so those were the main drivers. Was like, yeah, there was early adopter of SaaS, but mainly the shift from on-prem email to cloud email made it something that every organization needed, right? And the complexity of trying to solve that became too high. And so how do you get a new identity solution in place for that era? Kind of came with the email adoption to SaaS.
And at this point in the game, like who owns identity? Is it still owned by IT? Is it owned in part by security?
So I would say identity. Well, yeah, identity is still owned by IT in the early parts of the 2010s. So like we talk now that like, identity is the control plane. We talk about how identity-based attacks and threats, that kind of came out of the success of an Okta, right? Mm-hmm. So like pre-Okta, Active Directory was the center, right, of everything. All the attacks and lateral attacks and all the security, everything was focused on sort of Active Directory. SaaS was like cute, it was interesting, but like ultimately wasn't the main focus, because the main focus was getting password based, and still like nobody had MFA. Like honestly, like MFA was not you ran the MFA program at all.
You used it on like maybe you had it on like an RDP server, or you had it like in remote, like the privileged use cases.
So the low hanging fruit was like so big on just attacking all that, right? And going after all that from an attack perspective. And so again, so the security organizations kind of were still, I think, focused a little bit on endpoint security at the time. And then the network security started to change as the applications started to be critical applications, the tier one apps started to become hosted, not by you, but by a SaaS vendor. That started to change maybe a little bit of the relationship of where security was just focused purely on network, and had to think a little more broadly about the end-to-end, and also Amazon, right? Again, so my VMware shifts to Amazon, my tier one applications shift to SaaS. how do I rationalize risk, right, starts changing in a lot of organizations as a conversation. And so I think that's the rise is we're partnering with CIOs and CISO organizations that were more forward thinking of it, how to unbundle some of that more classic thinking, was really trying to help them be successful with AWS adoption, help them be successful with email transition to the cloud adoption, because the productivity gains spoke. Like you got hired, you got promoted, right, by your success and within those organizations. So if you could successfully, migrate all these legacy VMware workloads to AWS and get a huge OpEx savings, if you could successfully like do all these things in an organization, you got promoted and you got your next job, right?
Yeah. Yep. And then because I think there's this belief sometimes, I remember you beat this into me pretty hard at Okta, like this idea that there's like technology adoption cycles and there's things a lot of times get more complicated before they get simpler. In this stage of like cloud adoption, obviously there's companies that were born and raised in the cloud, but there's a lot of companies that had all this M&A and complex AD environments, and then they're adopting cloud. Like, did they simplify things? Is the world still super complicated and they just live in these hybrid environments? And is that going away, or is this just where we are right now, is like these hybrid complex environments?
I think we've read a crossing point, which is like, I think most organizations right now have cloud-based identity as part of their architecture, right? So it's not something that they're thinking about deploying. They've already sort of rolled it out. They might be switched vendors a few times. They're already in some level of like, it's a given capability within their organization. And the same thing with just, device management, with data, with cloud adoption. Like everyone's at higher levels of maturity across the board in all those vectors. So I think the conversations are just a little bit different because of where they're at and trying to figure out how to manage complexity. For example, at the number of AWS accounts, I have so many AWS accounts now. Yeah. Like, how do I back to that AD problem? Like, because like you have all these
driving. That's what's driving the adoption is the complexity. It's like, I started with a little bit of like AWS, but now I got 200 accounts. Like, how do I manage access?
But they're still dealing with a life cycle that they adapted to, which is like like iOS got really good at mobile management, right? Like the stack is pretty mature at this point as far as like, modern jam stuff and like how to integrate it into flows and, single sign on and, manage device attestation. All that stuff is pretty well built out from a capability perspective, where folks don't feel like they have to choose between corporate owned or BYOD anymore. But that was a huge problem statement of just like the tech stacks, the architecture, things there. So the platform's mature, the management technology is mature, the identity technology is mature, interoperability, these stuff is matured, where like, I don't think organizations are like thinking as heavily about that as like the biggest problem inside their organization. They still have the generalized problem of just collaboration in data, right? Which is just the problem statement is data is the risk and the data is moving all over the place, and the connections between applications and OAuth connections and SaaS to SaaS integrations. And like the problem is like I was really focused on like user to data. But ultimately, like these things are graphs of apps all collaborating, right? With data flowing all over the place that like becomes hard to think through, reason and mitigate risks around, which is just giving them a taste of like what's happening with the AI stuff. It's just like, I don't actually have. And so like before I might've been able to just kind of like pretend that I have the controls in place that I need as the numbers go from 10x to 1,000 to, to 10,000x, like I just can't pretend that stuff anymore. So if I don't have that stuff faked into, onboarding lifecycle, all those things, then I won't have any hope of mitigating the risk. But you still have the same adoption wave. Not every organization is deploying agents. Not every organization, they're experimenting. I mean, it looks so similar to like how experimentation with, AWS started to look at these organizations very early on, which was like everyone's just trying to figure out how to adopt the technology first. And then there's a lot of vendors trying to help with the adoption phase of early wins. And then the application models shift. And then as the application models shift, the identity of like the things
the
all
governance
kind of
model shift and like, it's all, it all gets pulled along.
It just feels very similar to like how, I mean, the scale of things are different for sure. Just because like a good example is because OAuth has had such successful deployment at scale across the internet, things like MCP can ride on top of it and get distribution at so much faster rate than where we were 15, 20 years ago. Because we were just trying to get people to think about delegating access to APIs, right? as a concept, like consent and all this, like, so we're able to ride on previous waves of investment, right? To accelerate and juice the waves, but it doesn't solve the problem statements end to end. And so we're dealing with all those gaps. And that brings in the question of like, do you evolve out or when do you throw it out and you net new? So we're having all those debates all over again. I mean, in some aspects, like when does it make sense to evolve out, which is like what the network guys were doing when the cloud and mobile stuff is like, oh, you don't need to throw away all your stuff. We'll move a data plane here and a cloud control plane here. You can keep your thing here, and like we'll slowly let you adopt the cloud and go. And some of those may have been the right choice for your organization based on, again, what you're trying to accomplish and the value you're getting out of things and where you're going. But you didn't see any, net new organizations build on those architectures and those primitives, because the primitives weren't really sufficient for where you are. You just were sort of meeting the market for where it was, not really enabling organizations to sort of build on the net new primitives. And that's really, I think, when things get interesting is when, like with Okta, when folks were able to sort of build on Okta as a concept in their organization, just get everything into Okta and just like get this horizontal control. MFA just starts appearing all over the place, right?
Yeah.
And then the value of it just like, wow, this thing's insane. I got MFA across 5 billion, authentications.
Right. So you go from basically like the enabling technology that enables a wave and a trend to like, okay, now I'm actually like a part of the infrastructure and like I can make everything better.
So that's happening again, I think, as well. But I mean, we still have a lot of the same problems with SaaS that haven't been solved, as I mentioned, which is just every SaaS is a snowflake. I have SSO, but like ultimately there's so many more problems to solve, share responsibility, XYZ, like all that stuff still exists. There's work to try to, improve that kind of stuff, but ultimately folks are still throwing that stuff behind SASE and central control points and things like that, because it's the only way I can get some level of outcome with the reality I have. I mean, it's the same trade-offs, which is, do I restrict the endpoint? Do I restrict the control points of the network? Like, where can I put some controls in place when the applications themselves they're not built natively for I guess the marketing term now is like identity fabric, but like applications are still built as, I'm a standalone app. I have my own user adoption funnel. I build all these capabilities because I want to own my own, user funnel, because I want to control growth, right? As a SaaS company. So I build all these capabilities to drive growth, which ultimately end up becoming liabilities for organizations down the road when they become, managed applications, because they have all these backdoors and use cases and, things for the end user to sort of drive. So like that still tension exists, because the economics of SaaS is changing, and who funds all this, investment still is I think a very open question in the industry as far as, sure. I mean, SSO, we can talk about SSO tax. We can talk about just modernizing some of these things in place. And then you get into like, shared signals and all these other interesting things, but like doing distributed stream processing and who pays for that stuff, right? And what's the economics of that stuff? It starts, again, I think, becoming a limiting factor to getting product managers interested in how getting customers insured. So the security community is trying to have a better voice at the table in some of those things. But I think, we're always in this modernizing challenge, which is the apps themselves, don't have a modern runtime to run in that the enterprise it's just
can trust and actually put security around and everything else. Yeah, totally. Awesome, dude. Thank you for coming. Okay, we hit the first two eras. We're going to hit the agentic era next. And that's like the big, and this is where the world's going and what's going to break and fall apart. So looking forward to having that conversation next.
Cool. Well, it was fun to chat.
Thanks, man. Thanks for tuning in. This episode of All Aboard is brought to you by the team at ConductorOne. We'd love to hear your feedback. Send us a message at allaboard@conductorone.com. Until next time.